Good evening, everybody. Nice of you to come this evening. I'm Mark Gilbert. I'm Grovehain's Professor of History here at Science Europe, as some of you know. Welcome to the seminar series, The History of the Present. The History of the Present. Now, previous speakers in this series, it's a series I've been running for a couple of years. Previous speakers this year included Alessandro Vitumi of the Free University of Amsterdam on the transatlantic relationship, Adela Kurishova of Charles University in France on the democratic recession in Central Europe. Last year we had the famous Canadian historian Margaret Macmillan talking about her book called War, and Kiran Patel of Munich University talking about the New Deal. Now, what's the objective of this series? What have I been trying to do in this series? I've been trying to show how history informs the present, how those of us who wish to make policy-making decisions or simply to understand the world events that are going on have to be able to grasp the historical roots, the historical antecedents, to use the title of today's lecture, in order to be able to grasp and understand the present. Historical context is always crucial, and it gives us greater understanding. So, last September, I discussed with, I contacted my good friend here, Daniel Beer, who I shall introduce in a moment, this evening's speaker, and asked him if he could give a historical perspective on the Kremlin's confrontation with the West. The timing is obviously now appropriate, although I'm sure all of us would wish it wasn't. So just to introduce tonight's speaker, and I'm sure we're going to have an extremely entertaining and insightful account of the antecedents of the Kremlin's policy towards the West. Daniel is a social, cultural, and intellectual historian of Tsarist Russia. He's written a great many distinguished books and articles, and I'm not going to list them all here, but one I certainly am going to list is his book, House of the Dead, Siberian Exile Under the Tsars, which was published by Alan Lane Penguin 2016-2017, and it won the 2017 Kundell Prize for History. The Kundell Prize is a prize organized by McGill University, and literally hundreds of the best books in history writing in English is published that are published every year are submitted to the prize to an international jury which awards the prize. And as I say, Daniel won the prize in 2017. And he was also shortlisted for several other major prizes, including the Wolfson Prize, which in Britain is a major award. He's a regular contributor to international literary journals. He's head of department, or HOD, as he tells me it's called, of the history department at Royal Holloway College of the University of London. And he's currently writing a book that will be called The Emperor Hunt, which is about the revolutionary campaign to assassinate Tsar Alexander II. Now, I'm not sure if he's going to put that idea forward as an option for our current difficulties, but I'm sure we're going to learn an awful lot from an expert. Daniel, floor to you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you for that introduction. And I'm extremely grateful to Professor Gilbert and to the Bologna Institute for Policy Research for the invitation. I've been looking forward to coming, but with a sort of a mounting sense of kind of trepidation, actually, as events have been developing over the last few months. I'd like to begin really with a statement of humility. I mean, I was planning to come and give a paper that was going to make one kind of argument, and I'll sort of flesh that out very briefly in a moment. But I actually find myself making an entirely different argument. So my sort of thinking on this question has evolved pretty rapidly since last September. So what I'd like to try to do today is to give some kind of outline of the historical thinking behind the Kremlin's confrontation with the West, and I guess ultimately its repudiation of the entire post-1991, one could, I think, argue the entire post-1945 geopolitical order in Europe. It's, of course, difficult to maintain analytical objectivity in the face of the horror of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the suffering of the Ukrainian people. So I'd just like to say at the outset, I'd like to start by expressing my complete condemnation of Russia's aggression and my solidarity with the Ukrainians. So there is a narrative about the Kremlin's ambitions in Eastern Europe that has become pretty familiar, I think, to most of us in the last 10 or 15 years, and it focuses on the history of the post-Soviet space. It argues that the Kremlin is responding to what it perceives to be two key threats. One is military and is posed by NATO's eastward expansion, and the other is political and is posed by the colored revolutions in the former Soviet states and the emergence of democratic alternatives to Russian authoritarianism on Russia's borders. This narrative is, I was going to elaborate on that narrative, but I think it's actually relatively well known now, and it's rehearsed with sort of varying degrees of detail and acuity in much of the good political journalism and political science that has covered Russia's rolling standoff with the Western powers in the last couple of decades. So what I'd like to do instead is to tell a story in a much longer frame that situates Russia's conflict with the West in the century or so that separated the Polish rebellion against Tsarist power in 1863 from the Soviet victory in the Second World War. And I find myself assisted in telling this story, curiously enough, by Vladimir Putin himself. Putin, in July of last year, published a 5,000-word article. You can read it on the Kremlin website. Well, you will have to wait for the Kremlin to be able to re-establish its website because it's been taken down by hackers. But the article is published on the Kremlin website, and it's entitled "On the Historical Unity of the Ukrainians and Russians." The article offered, among other things, a potted history of Russia's conflict with the Western powers stretching back some 3 centuries, and it framed the Ukrainian people themselves as one of the key battlegrounds in that conflict. I'm not going to quote much from the article. It's really not worth it, I think, but I'll just summarize Putin's claim. So he says that Ukraine is not and never has been an independent state. He claims that Ukraine is an inalienable part of Russia and it lacks a distinct ethnic identity, culture, religion, and language. Territorially, what is now independent Ukraine has, Putin argues, no basis in history and is comprised of lands that were acquired by the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. Ukraine has always prospered, Putin claims, when part of Russia and has suffered when not. And its independence has always been inspired and sponsored by enemies of Russia who have used it as a weapon against Russia. Putin framed these claims in a historical narrative that begins with what he terms an artificial project of Ukrainian statehood back in the 17th and 18th centuries during the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It was then exploited in the 19th century by the Polish national movement, and before World War I, it was used by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The goal was quite simple, as Putin wrote, to, quote, promote the anti-Russian concept and to separate part of one nation in order to make the rival weaker. Putin insisted that the notion of a separate Ukrainian nation, quote, became increasingly used for political purposes as a tool of rivalry between European states. But this argument, which swept aside differences in language, in history, culture, and especially political culture between Ukrainians and Russians was perceived by many as a denial of Ukraine's right to statehood. Though I think it would be fair to say that few, and I include myself in this, understood the essay as a political manifesto. The claim that the Russians and Ukrainians constitute one people is not new, either in Putin's pronouncements or indeed in the history of Russian political thought. The origins of that claim go back to at least the middle of the 19th century, when Russian imperial thinkers confronted the rise of Ukrainian romantic nationalism. It's often associated with the figure of the great Ukrainian poet Taras Shevchenko. And in response to this challenge, they formulated the concept of a triune Russian nation, which comprised Great Russians, or Russians as we would call them today, Little Russians, or Ukrainians, and White Russians, Belarusians. And in response to the Polish rebellion of 1863, which also engulfed much of the territory of today's Ukraine and Belarus, imperial authorities prohibited Ukrainian language publications in the empire and restricted cultural activities in the arts and sciences that sought to explore and promote Ukrainian culture. So there was a state-based definition of Russian imperial identity. So the word is rossiyskiy. So that think like British, which was gradually being replaced by a nationalized or ethnicized idea of Russian power, which was Ruski, or like English. And that representation was something that was based then increasingly on this concept, on this ethnic identity that's sort of gaining ground in the last decades of the 19th century. So policies of Russifications is what historians call these attempts to sort of suppress Ukrainian national consciousness, closure of churches, school, insisting that schools can only teach in Russian, restrictions on publishing and so on. So these policies of Russification delayed the development of Ukrainian national consciousness, but they didn't stop it altogether. And as the empire collapsed into war and revolution, Ukrainian activists created a state of their own, and in January 1918 declared independence. And in neighboring Austria-Hungary, Ukrainians declared independence as the Western Ukrainian Republic. This independence didn't last, but by the time the Bolsheviks had conquered most of what had been the Tsarist territories of Ukraine in 1920, the idea of independence, which had been sort of gestating, I suppose, over the preceding half century or more, could not simply be dismissed. The Bolsheviks were forced to recognize Ukraine as a separate nation and even grant pro forma independence to a Ukrainian Soviet republic. Indeed, the Soviet Union, which was created in 1922-23, emerged as a pseudo-federal rather than a unitary state, precisely in order to accommodate Ukraine and Georgia, the two most independent-minded republics whose communist leaders simply refused to join a Russian socialist state. So as a condition for consolidating their rule in the former territories of the Tsarist Empire, the Bolsheviks were forced to accommodate these insurgent nationalisms within a federative structure of the Soviet Union. And the right of states to secede from that union was enshrined in the Soviet Constitution of 1924. And this was, Putin argues in his essay, quote, the most dangerous time bomb which exploded the moment the safety mechanism, interesting choice of words, provided by the role of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was gone. So Putin rails against the fact that the Bolshevik leadership made the mistake of creating an artificial Ukrainian republic, a fabricated entity, which has been seized on subsequently by Russia's enemies keen to divide Russians from Russians, his view of the Ukrainians, and to create an anti-Moscow nation. So in Putin's telling then, the modern Ukrainian state is, and I quote again, entirely a product of the Soviet era. He argues that when Ukraine voted for independence in 1991, it rejected its own Soviet borders and therefore should, he claimed, leave with what you came in with. And what he believes Ukraine it came in with boils down to nothing at all. Eastern Ukraine, Putin claims, is basically Russia. Southern Ukraine is basically Russia. Transcarpathia is basically Russia. Kiev is essentially Russia. Even the heartland of Ukrainian nationalism in the West is basically Russia. And I quote, in 1939, the lands previously seized by Poland were returned to the USSR. This is his only reference to Stalin's deal with Hitler, carving up Poland. And that's all there is. The whole country, as far as Putin is concerned, is up for grabs. Now, one might wonder at the sources of this revanchist sort of imperialist nostalgia that seems to shape so much of the Kremlin's view of the former territories of the Soviet Union. There are many, but I will focus on one important one. Russians were never simply the former colonizers of their ethnic minorities and peripheries. They themselves lived under repressive regimes, whether Tsarist or Marxist, that frequently denied the rights of ethnic Russians, particularly in the provinces, and enslaved vast swathes of population, whether as serfs, as collective farm workers, or as prisoners in the Gulag. So just a slight detour here. So historians have long wrestled with the imperial status of the Soviet Union. So was it just a reincarnation of the Tsarist Empire, a continental relative of the overseas colonial empires of the British and the French, or did it resemble the modernizing regimes of Turkey and Iran? If the Soviet Union was an empire, it failed to manifest what is arguably the defining characteristic of empire: different regimes of government in the metropole and in the periphery. With varying degrees of intensity over the 7 decades of its rule, the Bolshevik Party subjected the entire population of the Soviet Union to coercive policies of resource extraction, modernization, and subjugation. It approached ethnic Russians themselves as objects of a civilizing mission, and instituted vertiginous political hierarchies of power across the country that were applied to ethnic Russians and not just to non-ethnic Russians. The British and the French empires had to contend with the manifest hypocrisy of systems built upon democracy at home and administrative rule abroad, respect for private property at home, but the expropriation of indigenous peoples abroad. The Soviet state spared itself such blushes by denying its entire population private property and political and religious freedoms. Instead, it offered a program of comprehensive modernization and the utopian promise of a better world, backed up, under Stalin at least, by the persuasive power of labor camps and firing squads. But ultimately, what the Soviet regime wanted was not the perpetuation of racialized and exclusionary hierarchies within its own population, but rather the modernization and the integration of minority cultures. And that policy came at the expense of privileging ethnic Russians within the Soviet Union. So having established the USSR, the Bolsheviks then launched a drive for linguistic and cultural homogenization within these republics. National music, literatures, histories, food, and dress would all be celebrated and promoted, provided they were infused with socialist ideals. National languages were used in schools, courts, factories, farms, and so on. People would, in addition to what Stephen Kotkin has called speaking Bolshevik, also speak their own national languages. Locals were hired into administrative positions and given preference over Russians in the workplace. The Soviet Union became, in the words of the Harvard historian Terry Martin, an affirmative action empire. National in form and socialist in content was the maxim, as Bolshevik leaders struggled to avoid what they, keen students of imperial collapse in 1917, understood to be the destabilizing effects of great Russian nationalism. Of course, the promotion of non-Russian nationalisms proved short-lived. Under Stalin, the supposed equality of all nationalities in the USSR was a political fiction. and national minorities, Germans, Poles, Finns, Koreans, Tatars, Chechens, and so on, found themselves the object of suspicion, and from the 1930s through the 1950s, of brutal campaigns of persecution, ethnic cleansing, and of course, in the case of Ukraine, a man-made famine, which many historians argue was an act of genocide. But both before and after Stalin, the USSR could lay some plausible claims to being a state that accommodated national differences within a political framework that strove for integration rather than exclusion. This historical context can help explain why Russians have come to see themselves as victims, whether of their own repressive regimes or of Western powers. Putin's essay last July and his rambling address on Monday, the 21st of February, which I mean now feels like, it feels an age away, but it was just the beginning of last week. His essay and his address bristled with resentment at the way in which the Russian world has been abused, divided, exploited by the machinations of foreign powers and by the stupidity of the Bolsheviks themselves. And this sense of victimhood may shed light on why Russian official culture in recent years has expressed an increased nostalgia for an imperial past. It's almost as if, in order to liberate themselves from their own history of subjection, the Russians in Putin's Russia should now reassert a late 19th century version of Russian imperial power, understood not as Rossiyskiy, the state-based version, but as Ruski, the ethnic-based version, over the national minorities of the former Tsarist Empire. No longer then the celebration of difference, but rather its denial. Do you want decommunization? Putin asked rhetorically of the Ukrainians in his speech last Monday. Well, that's fine with us, but don't stop halfway. We're ready to show you what genuine decommunization means for Ukraine. Putin's criticisms of Lenin's creation of an artificial Ukrainian state is an attempt to turn the clock back to the late 19th century, when policies of Russification and the suppression of non-Russian nationalisms on the imperial periphery were the order of the day. Central to this revanchist project is Putin's repeated invocation of the Russian world, or Ruski Mir. This is a term that really rose to prominence in the official media during the Euromaidan of 2014 and the annexation of Crimea, and it's been tirelessly pumped out by Kremlin channels ever since. Ideas that were previously the preserve of eccentric nationalists on the far right have since moved center stage in the broadcast media, the official press, and of course in the Kremlin's social media operation. They're supported by the creation of new and well-funded institutes, both in Russia and abroad, and backed by a slew of Kremlin sock puppets masquerading as historians. One of the pithiest formulations of the Russian world comes from Vladislav Surkov, the chief architect, scriptwriter, producer, one might say, of the Kremlin's Ukraine project. In an interview in June last year, Surkov declared, "The Russian world is something bigger than Russia itself. Because we are in fact a dispersed people, our population stretches well beyond our own borders. What is the Russian world to me? It's everywhere where people speak Russian and think like Russians, or where they respect Russian culture." So at his most expansive, Surkov claimed that the Russian world extended to all parts of the world where people respect and hold up Russia as a model of statehood worthy of emulation. But it's clear from his remarks that Russian ethnicity, speaking Russian, thinking like a Russian, is the key criteria for inclusion. So in this account, the Russians are a people divided and dispersed across borders by a combination of the machinations of Russia's enemies and the mistakes of the communists. Putin's historical mission is to reunite them. RIA Novosti, which is one of the main state news channels, precipitously published an article. So it appeared 2 days after the invasion began. and it was, sorry, it appeared earlier, but it was time-stamped for the 26th of February at 8 a.m. And it had clearly been intended for publication a few days into what the Kremlin was hoping would be a successful military operation, so a sort of successful blitzkrieg invasion of Ukraine. Got taken down very quickly once the mistake was noticed, but it's still accessible in archive form, and it gives an insight into the Kremlin's preferred framing of the invasion. It's written by a historian, a pro-Kremlin historian, Pyotr Akopov. And Akopov hails, so this is written in advance of the invasion, but he believes, he's anticipating what he thinks is going to be a great military success. Akopov calls this a new era. Russia is restoring, he argues, its historic unity. The tragedy of 1991, that terrible catastrophe of our history, that unnatural aberration, has been overcome. Akopov concedes that it's a, quote, a civil war in which brothers still shoot at each other, even though they are divided only by their membership of the Russian and the Ukrainian armies. But there will now no longer be a Ukraine, he rallies, which is anti-Russia. Putin, we're told, had to act now or lose Ukraine forever. And I quote again, "We can say without the slightest exaggeration that Vladimir Putin took upon himself a historic responsibility by deciding not to leave the resolution of the Ukrainian question to future generations. Now this problem no longer exists. Ukraine has returned to Russia. This doesn't mean that its statehood will be liquidated, but that it will be restructured, re-established, and returned to its natural condition as part of the Russian world, in which borders and in what form will be decided when we have placed a firm full stop to the history of Ukraine as an anti-Russian entity." So this account of Russians' imperial victimhood and Putin's restoration of their historically mandated unity is supplemented by a warped official history of World War II that has heroized the Soviet experience and demonized all opposition to Soviet rule as fascist and even genocidal. In post-Stalin Soviet society, World War II became elevated into a kind of state religion, which eventually eclipsed the original political religion of the revolution itself. Khrushchev's generation was the last really, I'm glossing here furiously, but Khrushchev's generation was the last that really believed in the construction of communism. The legitimacy of the regime for that generation still lay in the future, in the construction of a utopian society. But under Brezhnev, however, the regime gradually scaled back its ambitions, and instead of promising a grand vision of a bright future, it looked backwards to the USSR's victory in World War II as an almost transcendental act of salvation. The source of the regime's legitimacy now then lay in the past. This was, as Jeffrey Hosking has pointed out, second best, but it was a pretty good second best. And the great Soviet-era war memorials, such as the Mamayev Kurgan Museum of the Battle of Stalingrad, which was opened in 1967, or the Museum of the Great Patriotic War in Kiev, which was opened in 1981, are striking manifestations of this commemoration of victory in World War II in terms that were offered up as a validation of the entire Soviet project, the Soviet state, its history, its culture, and so on. But this tireless invocation of a narrative of heroism and self-sacrifice relied on the continuing demonization of all groups who fought against the Soviets during the war, often alongside the Germans, because they believed that under the umbrella of a German victory, they would be able to secure independence from Moscow. In official post-war culture, these people, whether Belarusians, Ukrainians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Estonians, and so on, were not motivated by a complex set of ambitions rooted in the radicalized, and yes, it's true, deeply problematic and very often extremely anti-Semitic political culture of the 1930s and 1940s, that collaborators were not, to quote Amir Viner, the byproducts of war. Instead, they were eternal enemies whom the war and occupation had helped to uncover. As such, they were beyond redemption. In Ukraine, nationalists who were convicted of membership of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists or the Ukrainian Patriotic Army were only granted rehabilitation in the summer of 1991 as the regime tottered towards collapse. The cult of the war only intensified in post-Soviet Russia, and especially actually since 2000, rehearsing the need to find historical sources of legitimacy in an often underwhelming present. The official Russian narrative of Russian or Soviet heroism arrayed against the forces of aggressive ethno-nationalism and fascist expansionism in World War II has been defended tirelessly through official media, rituals of public commemoration, and through the establishment of commissions on historical education, like the one set up by the former Minister of Culture and head of the hyper-patriotic Military Historical Society, Vladimir Medinsky. Alternative accounts have been stigmatized and persecuted. One notable recent casualty has been the human rights organization Memorial, which has undertaken a great deal of valuable research over the last 3 decades into the crimes of the Stalin era, including those committed during the war. It was finally closed down on Monday of this week after it lost an appeal against its conviction for violating the rules, the rules under which so-called foreign agents in Russia need to operate. So this official narrative of World War II, I think, is one through which the Kremlin has, at least publicly, confronted the challenges to its influence in Eastern Europe. Official news coverage of the Euromaidan in 2014 and the subsequent annexation of Crimea and the invasion of the Donbass in Russia made routine reference to the newly installed fascist junta in Kiev, filled the Russian infosphere with horrifying images of fascist hordes marching on Crimea, crucifying children, and so on. The propagation of the St. George ribbons, those orange and black ribbons that are now very popular in Russia itself, created a visual continuity between opposition to the Euromaidan in Kiev and the defeat of fascism in the Second World War. So these were ribbons that were worn by veterans after World War II. In one news segment, I remember from 2014, a celebrated TV anchor took his viewers down into the state archives in Moscow to unearth documents about atrocities perpetrated against ethnic Russians by the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists during World War II. And this was to emphasize the degree to which events in contemporary Ukraine were only the latest attempt by fascists to seize control of the country and cleanse it of non-Ukrainians. Putin's reference this is like 10 days ago, he referred to the Banderovtsi who were now going to be dealt with in Kiev. That's a reference to the Ukrainian wartime fascist leader Stepan Bandera and neo-Nazis who were in charge of the regime in Kiev, was clearly intended to frame the conflict through that lens, an official Soviet and increasingly Russified narratives about the war. So Putin's regime has sought to transfer the mantle of anti-fascism away from the Soviet people to the Russian world, and in so doing to conflate the defense of Russians with the victory over fascism. So I guess I'm ending on a very sober note, which is to say that the story of NATO expansion and of Russian pushback, of the Kremlin's fears of colored revolutions on its own border, is only part, and maybe not even the most important part, of the explanation for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Putin is thinking not just geopolitically, he is also thinking historically. Many Kremlin watchers have in the last decade or so, and again, I include myself in this, assumed that the Kremlin's sort of forays into historical narratives were essentially window dressing on a geopolitical project that was sort of rooted in sober strategic calculations. So they were one plank in a wider cultural project of mobilization that was designed to kind of rally the Russian population behind the Kremlin's policies. But I think the invasion of Ukraine and the brutality with which it is now being conducted suggest, I think, that we need to take the historical agenda much more seriously. Putin might, after all, be a true believer. And if Russian history teaches us anything, it's beware the true believers. Thank you.
Daniel, thank you very much indeed. I learned, as I expected to, a great deal. Now, what I'm going to propose is that I'm going to ask a question just to start things going. Then I'm going to throw it open to people in the room. So I'd urge you to think of questions. When you ask a question, please state your name and where you're from before asking the question. And I would ask the many people online, please, to use the Q&A function to send me questions as we proceed with the Q&A. So the question I wanted to ask you, in effect, in a way, you not in a way, you certainly did answer it right at the end. Putin is thinking historically. Can we build a bit more on this? I mean, there is a historical notion of what Russia should be, and that this is driving policy. It's ideas matter. It's not just a question of thinking, we can grab a bit of land here, we can put pressure on the West here. There is a bigger project at work.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, this essay that was published by the Kremlin in July last year, and in this very lengthy address on the 21st of March, it was sort of like in a speech which I have to restate. I am not an expert on contemporary Russian politics, but I think there seems to be a consensus that Putin was probably the author of this speech. Were deeply historical. I mean, this was both the article and particularly the speech, crafted a narrative about political imperatives and tough choices and the necessity of action that were all rooted in this sort of sprawling, and it has, and of course it probably bears repeating, deeply eccentric and highly selective and distorted version of history. But I think it really, and also, I mean, these arguments are of course echoed in the wider kind of Russian informational sphere. I mean, they are pumped out endlessly on Russian TV networks, in blog posts and across social media. But it's really striking that this is history is being summoned here by the Kremlin as an alibi for its actions in Ukraine. I mean, that would be the kind of sort of minimal claim, I think. I mean, the more maximalist claim is that Putin and it seems to be a very small group of individuals who are advising him, and quite what the weight of their advice is seems to be sort of rather doubtful at the moment. They genuinely believe this stuff. That it's not. This is not, as I said at the end. These are not sort of convenient narratives where you sort of root around in the grab bag of history and pull out a few sort of facts, and you discard others, and you kind of trot them out in the service of your arguments. But this is an entire kind of geopolitical strategy now that is rooted in this historical understanding of Russia's victimhood in Europe, and a historically mandated ambition to right that, to right that wrong, to correct it. So I think it can't be, it cannot be overstated. I don't want to reduce everything that the Kremlin is doing to its understanding of history. I mean, of course, there are other arguments that come into play, but I do think that, I think we really do need to think seriously about what, if the Kremlin sets out its stall in this way, and it is explaining its ambitions in this way, then I think that, they need to be taken seriously as part of our understanding of what is happening and what will likely continue to happen.
Are there any questions from the audience now? Because I have several questions coming in. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Connor Freidenborg. I'm from the New York area. Question is this going to stop at Ukraine with Vladimir Putin's ambitions? If the answer is yes, why do you believe that? And if the answer is no, then where does it stop?
In fact, I actually came very close to asking that question as well, Daniel, because you're giving the idea that there are certain thinkers who think Russia is wherever Russians are.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. Well, I think there is clearly something particular about Ukraine. This narrative of Russia's past is very much, embedded in the territories that make up contemporary, the contemporary Ukrainian state. I don't. If your question is, does Putin want to reconstitute like the entirety of the former Soviet space? I don't think that's likely. I don't think the Kremlin has any particular interest in the conquest of, Uzbekistan but I think that where there are large numbers of ethnic, one's got to be very careful with the use of terms here, with people whom the Kremlin believe are Russian. I mean, whether or not they themselves choose to identify with being Russian is another matter. I think those territories are potentially up for grabs, but of course, there are lots of obstacles to that. So, I mean, if I were a Russian speaker, or if I were an Estonian, living in Narva, where there's a large Russian-speaking population, I would be feeling extremely nervous if it were not for the fact that Estonia is a NATO member state. But I think that, I think that this is in a way this is an important test case, because I think if there are not really massive costs for the Kremlin in Ukraine, which I think there weren't after Crimea, really. I think there are certainly other parts around the kind of the periphery of the Russian Federation where they would be pursuing a kind of playbook of fomenting separatist sentiment and so on. So I think what's striking really about what's happened in Ukraine is they seemed to have a kind of an established playbook, which was about sort of infiltration of regions, from sort of the fomenting discontent, promoting separatist feeling, but it was nothing like this. I mean, this sort of a full frontal assault on a sovereign state, clearly with the view of dismembering it in its current form. So I don't think that the borders of the Soviet Union in 1991 are really what Putin actually in his speech is quite critical of the Soviet Union because he sees it as a state that basically did a disservice to the Russians because it was accommodating all of these non-Russians. So I think this is a much more sort of Russian nationalist project, kind of red in tooth and claw.
On that topic, and I'm just going to read out a couple of questions that I've received online. One is from our very distinguished former colleague, Adrian Littleton, who's a historian of Italy. And he says, would you like to comment on the role of Alexander Dugin and the ideology of Eurasianism, and more in general, Putin's patronage of thinkers who have ties to earlier extreme right ideology? And second, from Stephen Jaskowski, who has also asked whether the recording of this discussion will be available, and the answer is yes on the Bologna Institute for Policy Research website. Thank you for a brilliant and penetrating analysis. And he asks, it answered a lengthy question I typed and deleted concerning George Kennan's observation long ago that Russia's rulers have considered the fragility of their legitimacy so dire that Moscow could only consider its neighbors either as vassals or enemies. I have long wondered about any connection between that fragility and Russia's nationality problem. What ideal beyond identity, politics, Russian nationalism and orthodoxy exists in Russian history that can hold the Federation together? So those are the two questions.
Yeah, both very good questions. Yeah, I mean, people like Dugin, so you know, he's a kind of a sort of an eccentric sort of hyper nationalist thinker in Russia, and it seemed for a long time. I mean, he's been spewing out political sort of pamphlets and historical studies for decades. And Putin had a kind of flirtation with him in the 2000s, but it seemed I'm not speaking here as an expert, I suppose, just like an informed observer. I think most people felt that the Kremlin kind of flirted with Russian nationalism in that form, but actually kind of rode back from it because it was understood. The Russian Federation is today still a multi-ethnic, multi-confessional state. I mean, if you really start defining the state along these very hard and fast nationalist lines, it creates a pretty unstable, set of relationships with large parts of your own population. But I think the turning point probably did come with Crimea and with the annexation of Crimea. And I think in order to legitimize the annexation, and I suppose also to sort of derive political capital from it at home, because it was very popular among ordinary Russians. But also the invasion of the Donbass, I think the regime sort of went for broke in a way, and it started to identify itself much more unambiguously with this vision of Russia and Russian history and the Russian world that had long been espoused by these sort of fairly marginal figures. I mean, we can all think of historical analogies where sort of historically marginal figures suddenly find themselves center stage. But it's now amplified by the mainstream media. So the kinds of arguments that would have been circulating in sort of like in long sort of Facebook posts that might have attracted a few hundred likes in 2010 are now being essentially rehearsed in TV studios, every night of the week. So the shift is really dramatic. The second question, also is a very good one. I mean, I do think that so why has, I suppose the question really, I mean, if I were, I'm not, but if I were an advisor or, sitting in the Kremlin, I mean, the question I would be asking is why has the state since 1991 evolved in ways that have not acted as a kind of, as a magnet for populations on the periphery, many of whom have actually fared because they haven't been graced with hydrocarbons in the way that the Russian state is, and other natural resources, have actually fared economically much worse, than Russians. So, I think the question, or in a sense, the show of force is in a sense an admission of kind of cultural sort of weakness, kind of political weakness, that the state has not found ways of drawing in populations through, and I don't mean sort of reabsorbing them, but simply establishing, very close kind of, economic and cultural and political links, and quite to the contrary. I mean, the Kremlin, the invasion, I mean, the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014 had the effect of radicalizing, opinion in a country that had historically, been, I mean, most of the population very, sort of sympathetic to Russia, very close cultural and civilizational ties that we, can see being sundered now, almost by the hour, or indeed by the hour. And it took a state which I think clearly did not, and a population that did not want to have to make a choice between sort of Russia and the West, but wanted to exist, in a position of having good relations with both, and of course the effect on Ukrainian national identity has been dramatic, and I think that the current invasion will, in the long term, do nothing but ensure that Ukrainian national identity is almost defines itself in opposition to Russia, much the same way that sort of the Poles think of Russia. So I think that the question of why is Kennan's observation still so pertinent? I think speaks to a failure in the post-Soviet space to kind of articulate a vision of Russian, Russian statehood, Russian culture that is appealing to people who have sort of one foot outside of that space, who kind of have other options and alliances available to them.
I have a stream of questions coming in. It's like watching a ticker tape sort of going over. Would anybody here present like to ask a question first? But two.
Hello, Professor. Thank you very much for very interesting explanation and analysis. My name is
Rory.
Yes. My name is Rory. I'm from the U.S., Massachusetts in particular. I'm wondering if Vladimir Putin is notoriously very paranoid. I'm wondering if there might be a historical root from the same period in the 19th, 18th centuries that might inform that paranoia, if it could be explained that way.
Okay. And before you answer the question, Peter, could you ask your?
Yes, hi, thanks. This is a wonderful exchange and wonderful lecture. Peter Lewis, I teach in SAIS in Washington and mostly Africa, but there are a lot of interesting connections here. I guess I'm struck by a fundamental contradiction in this account, and it's not a problem with the account, it's a problem with the underlying dynamic. If Putin was somebody who was a loyal KGB agent and an essential component of the system in 1990, that was a system in which Stalin's ethnic nationalities policy was the foundation of the USSR, and therefore would have given some validity to the idea of a Ukrainian identity and a Ukrainian republic. And now here we are 30 years later, and his strategy and his narrative is fundamentally based on denying that republic. So on the one hand, he has a kind of revanchist nostalgia about the USSR, having called it one of the greatest historical catastrophes of the century, its dissolution. On the other hand, he's saying that it was essentially built on fantasy, lies, constructions, and it lacked fundamental legitimacy. So if you could speak to that, maybe I'm perceiving it in a muddled way, but I'd be interested.
Thank you.
Thank you. 5 more.
If I could take the second question first, I mean, actually, that quote, which is endlessly, trotted out in kind of political, sort of journalism about biographies about Putin, actually is a Putin says that it was the greatest, whatever he said, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe because it separated Russians from Russians, not because it meant that Lithuanians got their own state. So he saw it, I think, from, at least his kind of, we don't really know what Putin, his like the prominence of Putin's kind of political philosophy is much reduced before 2000. But I think he did perceive it. Very, very early on, and as lots of Russians did. This is not. I don't want to present Putin as if he's just a kind of a completely cookie. That this is a view that's was kind of widely shared. But the real the catastrophe was that the state collapsed, and suddenly millions of Russians, as Putin would see them, found themselves outside the borders of their own state. So, I think that's what sort of links the two. The Soviet Union was kind of okay while it lasted, although it didn't privilege Russians, in the way that it should have. But the real catastrophe came when it collapsed. And in Putin's sort of narrative, that collapse was kind of hardwired into this design flaw, which gave the republics the right to secede. So I also think, I know the thing about tell me where you were born, and I'll tell you what you were, or where you were born, and I will tell you what your political views are. I do think that if we read carefully the sorts of the kinds of things that Putin has been saying over 20 years, I think his thinking has also developed and changed, and it's probably he's come under various kinds of influences, and I'm not someone who's a great enthusiast for kind of psychohistory, but I think this is a guy who's in his late 60s. He's clearly thinking about his historical kind of legacy. There is nothing left to steal. There are no more palaces to build. How do you want to be remembered? And I think that kind of, again, that's where the sort of the righting of these great historical wrongs comes in, because Putin wants to go down in history as the Russian leader who once again gathered the Russian lands and gathered the Russian people. And then on the first question about paranoia, which I suppose is part of the same thing. I think there is a continuity throughout Russian political culture, very authoritarian regimes that become increasingly focused upon one particular individual. And I think that there are different ways of casting it. You can either say, look, that's it, that just in terms of someone's sort of general mental health and their ability to kind of, deal with kind of, doubt and argument and challenge and stuff. That's a very weird position to be in for a very long time. But I also think you can think about it sort of institutionally, that there is just something deeply, it would seem deeply disturbing and deeply flawed in the way that kind of information and political authority are sort of interacting with each other in the Kremlin. And there are echoes of that, of course, throughout the other bits of Russian history. Everything about Nicholas II in 1905, or during the First World War, or Stalin on the eve of the Second World War, and so on. So people, you have such unchallenged authority, and people are so scared of you, and there are incentives built into these systems of people telling the boss what he wants to know, and that's how you kind of win favor. Putin was again on RIA Novosti today saying that there is no bombardment of civilian areas of Russian towns and cities, or his claims that the Ukrainian regime was run by, he said, junkies and neo-Nazis. It's just, either he's entirely cynical and he's sort of, he's kind of chortling behind his hand as he says these things, or actually he has been fed, sort of information which seems, at least in part, to substantiate these things. And so I think I think paranoia, it sort of, for me, it reduces it to kind of an individual weakness, like a personal failing, Whereas I think there is kind of there's something institutional here as well, which has these longer sort of historical roots.
Okay, a series of questions. Joanna Pineda writes, we've been talking a lot about Putin. Does the whole Kremlin establishment feel this way? And what are the likely possibilities of future leaderships following this project that you're describing? I've slightly changed the question, shaped the question. Tommaso Milani writes, thank you for your fascinating talk. Based on your reading of Putin's thinking, may denazification of Ukraine, if successfully implemented in the aftermath of a military victory, result in large-scale ethnic cleansing? In other words, does Russification imply elimination, I presume? And Simona Tollens, who is at the EUI and also teaches here as an adjunct, says, thank you for your wonderful talk. Two questions. One, when does history seem to matter to Putin's Russia? When not and when less? We've seen military resurgent Russia in Syria, for instance, and in Libya more indirectly. How do you make sense of these overtures in this historically embedded political legitimacy? And her second question is, the USSR also professed an anti-imperialist narrative. How does this sit in the present historical narrative? Is it forgotten or recounted somehow?
Thank you. They're all very good questions. So the first one about the Kremlin, or the great, I suppose it's sometimes referred to as the Greater Kremlin. So the kind of the top tier, maybe the second tier of political associates and sort of power brokers. It's again, I suppose we're slightly back to sort of, but the Kremlin doesn't really leak. I gather. So it's very hard to know. I mean, there was that. At the beginning of last week, there was that really bizarre sort of political performance in the Security Council of the Russian Federation, where Putin's sitting at his desk and a succession of very senior political figures had to take their turn at the lectern, parroting back to Putin what he clearly wanted to hear, and in a sense, I suppose, to kind of bind them publicly to what was about to happen. That would the expressions on the faces of some of those people and the kind of the stammering performance of his spy chief Narishkin would suggest that some people are probably pretty horrified by what's happening. I think that those with substantial economic interest that are going to be damaged by Western sanctions are probably pretty horrified. And a few have spoken out. I mean, a few of the oligarchs have actually sort of taken to social media to kind of make it clear. I mean, not in particularly robust terms, it has to be said, but to kind of let it be known that they don't support what's going on. The question of whether anything will actually come from that, though, I think is a very different one. I mean, they are I think. They are really bound to Putin. I mean, he's the kind of the foundation of the entire sort of political system in Russia. I mean, he's like the sort of he's like the hub, in which his role has been to kind of broker kind of relations between the various actors. And I think also that a lot of them still at the moment think probably that this is going to be bad, but we'll ride it out. There'll be terrible sanctions, but there were sanctions after Crimea. The state has our back. We will be compensated. Some of them will do quite well, of course, from the kind of the sort of what look like increasingly autarkic economic policies that the Kremlin will have to introduce. So I think the chances of a palace coup look pretty remote. I mean, at least to me. I think the army is maybe slightly different. I think that, throughout Russian history, returning soldiers from conflicts have been a very destabilizing kind of political force. And if very large numbers of young Russians who are exposed to, the fighting in Ukraine and, see firsthand the degree to which what the Kremlin is saying does not, match up with what is on the ground. I mean, that might be a different sort of avenue for political change, but I don't think it's going to happen very, very quickly. In terms of, so the question about denazification. Yeah, I think that's, yeah. So I think that, I think it does, it does mean basically the purging of the population. And I think that it will probably mean, I think the Kremlin, would probably be quite happy with large scale population displacement. Maybe there is a rump Ukrainian state left in Kiev, in the western territories of Ukraine, and if you don't want to be part of the Russian world, you can go there, or you will be taken there. So I think that there will be. I mean, we don't know, and I suppose there can be different levels of purging. But when the Russians use the word denazification, that is what it means historically. I mean, it means a wholesale purge and a wholesale purge and a kind of restructuring of the economic and the political kind of bedrock of a society. I mean, that's what it meant at the end of the Second World War. Denazification did not mean putting a few people on trial for crimes that they had individually committed. It meant prosecuting, well, not prosecuting, but it meant persecuting entire swathes of the population who were associated with fascism. So I mean, again, if we're going to take seriously this position that sort of historical references matter, I think that's a pretty grim one. The question about when doesn't this stuff matter? Look, I'm not arguing that all of the Kremlin's behavior, abroad is reducible to this proposition. Of course, it is also engaged in other theaters where the Russian world is not really at stake, and I think it's pursuing geopolitical goals that others will be much better placed to comment on than me, but which are much more recognizable, I think, in terms of the kind of the sort of the struggle for international sort of supremacy and influence and access to resources and all of those sorts of things. So I think that history matters a great deal in this particular context. It might matter less in others. And the anti-imperialist narrative, I didn't manage to scribble.
The USSR also professed an anti-imperialist narrative. How does this sit in the present narrative? Is it forgotten or recanted?
Yeah, yes, I think because that's a great question. It's still there. The Russians are not. The Kremlin argues the Russians are not engaged in an imperialist war. They are engaged in a war against the encroaching empire of the West and NATO. They are the plucky underdog. So they are in many ways they are sort of continuing that sort of anti-imperialist crusade. So at least in official culture, I don't think there's really any kind of cognitive dissonance between these positions. Putin is not, he would argue, waging a war of imperial conquest in Ukraine. He is liberating Russians from their subjugation by an alien and fascist, regime that is backed by Western imperialist powers. This is a war of kind of decolonization, if you like, rather than of imperialism.
Also, that message resonates broadly with a segment of the Indian public and a large segment of the or a significant segment of the public in Africa and in African countries, and you see it on social media.
I would add, I live in the UK. I mean, you see it in the UK as well. I mean, there are plenty of kind of political groupings in Jeremy Corbyn was I think at a march yesterday that was protesting about NATO aggression in Ukraine. So it's that position is shared by part of the left, certainly. Yeah.
Jeremy Corbyn being the former head
Oh,
of
sorry,
the British Labour Party.
That's right. Yeah.
Yes. I've got a very good question online that I want to ask, and I've got time for 2 more questions. So does somebody want to ask a question from the audience? Okay, I'll ask my online question. This is from Justin Frozini, who's Professor of Constitutional Law here. He says, Ukraine's tangled history with Russia can also be seen with regard to Ukraine's majority Orthodox Christian population, which, if I'm not mistaken, is divided between an independent-minded group based in Kyiv and another loyal to its patriarch in Moscow. So how is religion linked to Russia's invasion of Ukraine? And then there's a second question from Elaine Grigsby, who asks, how prominent is the argument that this is not about, that the crisis is not about expanding NATO and putting missiles on the border with Russia? I assume that means, to what extent is the debate about, we're all talking here in the West about NATO expansion as having been something provoked that. I suppose what she's asking is, in Russia, are people claiming this?
Okay, so in the first question, it is. I mean, so the question of to what degree are sort of confessional divisions within Ukraine a factor, or to what extent are they represented as being a factor? They are, but I think that the kind of the religious question is sort of it's a constituent feature of this idea of the Russian world. So I mean, it's something that is used. I mean, of course, yes, there are confessional divisions within Ukraine. I mean, there are confessional divisions within most European states. I mean, I think that what I think Ukraine, and again, I need to stress, I'm not an expert on contemporary Ukraine, but I think the broad consensus among experts of the topic would be that Ukraine's sort of achievement in the last 30 years has been to develop a kind of civic idea of national identity that accommodates people of different faiths, whether you are Catholic, or you are Orthodox, or you are Jewish, or whether you are a Russian speaker, or you are Tatar, or whether you are a Ukrainian speaker. And of course, most people are combinations of all of the above. So I think that the religious divisions, I mean, they have been used, but I think they play sort of second fiddle to this idea of Russian speakers. I think is probably the primary point of reference to this use of sort of the Russian world. So I think that is sort of a constituent feature. The NATO expansion has been hugely emphasized in. I've been going to Russia since the early 90s. I mean, certainly from sort of 2000 onwards. Putin gave that famous address at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, I think, where it was basically that was the, no further, this is, and that view of Russia as being, essentially under a kind of creeping invasion by Western powers, sort of nibbling away at its near abroad, moving ever closer towards Russia's own borders, is something that has been, one of the kind of principal themes of Russia's international relations in the official media since 2000. I mean, I have to say, if I were a Russian, I probably wouldn't be thrilled at the expansion of NATO. I mean, I think I think we should be blunt about that. It's NATO is not an organization that has historically been very friendly towards the Russians. I mean, I can understand that there's a great deal of kind of nervousness in Russia about NATO expansion. But I think the paradox, of course, is that, you know, if Putin didn't exist today, you know, NATO would have to invent him. You know, he's done more to kind of stiffen the resolve and you know, loosen the purse strings of NATO member states than you know, anything else in the last you know, the last 30 years.
One last question from me. Can you have political freedom without critical thinking about history?
No, that's a very good question, and I think the answer is no, and that's one of the reasons why the Kremlin has, you know, been so energetic in the promotion of official, you know, historical narratives, and has, you know, I mean, there have been certain sort of, you know, kind of particular points of kind of sensitivity, like, you know, the official narratives about the Second World War, and it was actually under Medvedev, when Medvedev was president, in that brief interlude now of 4 years, from 2008 to 2012, when, you know, a commission was set up to basically try to silence histories of the Second World War that talked about things like, you know, Katyn massacre and deportations of national minorities, and you know, some of the you know, the war crimes that were committed by the Red Army. So it has, I mean, certainly the Kremlin thinks that if you do have critical thinking about history, hanging on to power is hanging on to a particular version of power is much more challenging.
Well, I think we've had some critical thinking about history tonight, and we shall have some more in this series in the future. Thanks, Dan. It's been fantastic.
Thank you very much.